Back in the 1960s, Wendy Carlos wanted to make electronic music, but she had a problem. Everybody fucking hated electronic music. In this video, we'll learn the incredible story of how that happened and whether Wendy Carlos was able to make electronic music like she wanted. My name is Sarah, and I normally run a YouTube channel called Sounds Good. This is the first in a series of videos that I'm doing in collaboration with UJAM to celebrate the release of their new line of synthesizers called the Usynth. Back then, almost no one would have guessed that it would become what it has today. Back in the 60s, electronic gear was extremely expensive. So if you wanted to make electronic music, you'd have to go to a big university or a national broadcasting company. But not just anybody could show up to one of these places and start making their beat boops. Only the most specialized and highly trained people had access. So in the 60s, electronic music sounded like it was made by only people who were the most trained and specialized, aka not very fun. But how do we get from that point to now, when even rock bands like Fall Out Boy make electronic music? Never see any of you again. So what was the first electronic music actually like? Was it all just terrible, boring beat boops? Well, it's definitely not easy to digest, but I do think that when taken in context, it is pretty beautiful in its own unique way. One thing to keep in mind is that because synthesizers were so expensive back then, there were just very few of them. If there was a studio in your country at all, chances are almost 100% that there was only one. So that meant that the studios were very separated from one another, both physically and culturally. So each studio developed its own specific vibe. One of the most famous studios was the UJAM in France. A unique style of music called musique concrète was developed there. The musique concrète people were all about using sounds from real life, like the sound of your gamer GF's bathwater running or walking on a dirt road. They would manipulate these recordings by cutting them up and fitting them back together, or re-recording them at faster and slower speeds. Then they would use these manipulated recordings to make a sort of montage. In contrast to the artsy-fartsy French, the Germans were all about pure electronic music. They used electronic sound generators like sine wave generators, impulse generators, and white noise generators. And their style was really influenced by the very formal and ordered modernist style that was popular at the time. Although the WDR and UJAM were definitely the most famous studios, there were people busy making electronic music all over the world. At the NHK in Japan, they had a lot of the same tools as they did at the WDR, but the Japanese independently arrived at a style that was much more similar to musique concrète. There was also the Radiophonic Workshop in the UK, the Columbia Princeton Music Center, and the San Francisco Tape Music Center in the US, and the Studio di Fonologia in Italy. By the 1970s, electronic music studios were popping up all over the world. There was dub music being made in Jamaica, and there were thriving scenes in Iran, Indonesia, and all over the African continent. So in the 60s, everyone thought that electronic music was just weird beat boops. So how did Wendy Carlos deal with this problem? Well, to start with, she met an engineer who was interested in making synthesizers named Bob Moog. Moog didn't have much of a musical background and recognized that he needed feedback from an actual musician. So Carlos, who studied composition at Columbia, would borrow his prototypes and give him feedback in exchange for being able to use them herself at home. So now that she had the gear, Carlos needed to figure out how to actually reach people. She recorded several experiments at her home studio after meeting Moog, including some versions of some old Bach pieces. She eventually met a producer named Rachel Elkind, who told her that everything that she made was crap. Except for the Bach experiments. So the two of them made the Bach pieces into a full-length album and sold it to CBS. This record, called Switched on Bach, went on to popularize electronic music more than any other record in history. Of all time. It sold over 1 million copies, and it would have been the first time that most people had ever heard electronic music. It also directly inspired a bunch of pop musicians like the Beatles, Stevie Wonder, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer to start using synthesizers. After the pop musicians got a hold of it, the rest is history. Synthesizers, specifically Moog synthesizers, quickly became sexy and cool. Like me. Synthesizers also started making it into film soundtracks. And again, Wendy Carlos was early to the party. She made an electronic soundtrack for A Clockwork Orange way before everyone else in 1971. Then in 1978, Giorgio Moroder made the soundtrack for Midnight Express using synthesizers. By the early 80s, synthesizers were all over Hollywood movies, including Blade Runner, Tron, Scarface, Videodrome, Ghostbusters, The Terminator. I could go on forever. So at this point, synthesizers were definitely not just obscure beat boop machines anymore. But relatively speaking, they were still very exclusive. Paul McCartney can afford one is not exactly the ultimate sign of accessibility. But there were two major technological developments in the 1980s that lowered the barrier to access. All the commercial synthesizers up to this point were subtractive analog synthesizers. Subtractive synthesis uses a complex waveform that you subtract from using a filter to make a more musical sound. And this means that for those synths, every individual component had to have its own analog circuit, aka they were not cheap. But at around this time, a researcher named John Chowning was working on an algorithm for a different kind of synthesis that could kind of circumvent this problem a little bit. This type of synthesis, called FM, could be implemented digitally, which means that the whole synth could be implemented with just a couple chips, aka much cheaper. In 1983, Yamaha came out with the first digital commercial synthesizer called the DX7, and it went on to sell over 200,000 copies. A new problem came with the invention of digital synthesizers, though. A synth of a given company could only communicate with other synths of the same company. But the synthesizer company daddies quickly realized this was bad for business and got their heads together to try to fix the problem. And pretty quickly after, they came up with the Musical Instrument Digital Interface, or MIDI. This made life much easier for music producers. But much more importantly, it also coincided with the rise of the digital sampler. The sampler totally changed the way that people thought about music and the way they made music. But it also meant that hundreds of thousands of new people had access to electronic music technology for the first time. And it was in this context that some of the most popular genres of music of today came into existence, like hip-hop and dance music. Okay, so at this point, we're living in a highly accessible electronic music utopia, right? Wrong! Wrong, wrong, wrong. Wrong. Go home. The sampler that supposedly democratized electronic music, the MPC-60, cost around $5,000. A DX7 cost $2,000, and with that, you'd still need to find a way to actually record your music. So if you had about $10,000 1980s dollars, then yes, electronic music was democratized. For most people, it was the personal computer that made making electronic music genuinely accessible. Now, digital audio workstations, or DAWs, can do everything that those 1980s home studio setups could, but like a million times more powerfully and efficiently. Not only can people now get access to the tools they need, they can also share their music, tools, and knowledge on the internet. And the internet has done more than anything else to accelerate the popularity of electronic music. Like if you want to learn the history of electronic music, you can go to youtube.com and type in UJAM X Sounds Good, History of Electronic Music. The story of electronic music becoming popular is basically a story of accessibility. And the reason why we wanted to tell this story is that the Usynth is also all about accessibility. So keep your eyes out for the next video so you can learn all about it. And more, much more.